Hey everybody, it's Jurius Doctor, back again with another video. This time I'm going to be taking a look at a review of the last 6 years in EVE, from Rubicon to today. This is the overview video for what will be a series of 6 videos covering the last several years. Now, a big part of the antecedent action in this, and talking about a timeline of the development of EVE for returning players or for new players, is to talk about where a lot of the driver for a lot of the intensified development in the last 6 years has come from. And so it's really important, I think, to talk about spaghetti code. And what this refers to is, I'll speak specifically to a comment made in the old forums by CCP Master Plan 2 years ago. There had been a rumor floating around that some developer at EVE Online had written something like 1.5 million lines of spaghetti code and then got hit by a bus without having commented any of his code. As CCP Masterplan puts it, he says, I can't really say that that's true, but what he did say was, typically the older an EVE system is, the lower the quality of its original documentation. This might be a result of startup pressures, where you can either spend extra time to do it right or potentially run out of money before you finish, or take shortcuts to increase your chance of having an actual product that can start earning income. One of those cases, you have a badly documented project that somehow gets on to survive for 15 plus years of further development. In the other case, well, you don't know what happens because that project might not be around due to never getting out the door in the first place. He says, I'm absolutely not endorsing bad engineering principles here. I'm merely relating the market truths that I've seen play out in different projects at different companies, some of which are around today and some of which are not. And he says specifically, in addition, I don't think that the player-owned Starbase code is anywhere near 1 million lines. One of the reasons the player-owned Starbase code comes up is that there was a time in the game where a lot of the earlier code wasn't commented. And for those who don't understand programming, I think it's important to point out that in programming, regardless of the language that you're using, most syntaxes have a way of quote-unquote commenting out code. And what this is, respective to EVE Online, is Python. And in Python, there's a few different ways to comment out code, as there is in C++ and other languages. But typically, you'll introduce a couple of characters, whether it be a couple of backslashes, a couple of hash signs, a couple of asterisks. Usually, there's a key combination or character combination that indicates to the compiler or to the runtime of the code that the following lines are to be ignored and not counted as part of the run of the code. And code runs top to bottom. So it runs through, it reads the order of operations, and it runs the code in that order, referring to whatever other things it pulls in or imports. As particularly in Python, you can do a lot of magic with the import function. So a lot of how early CCP development happened was that people would write code, but there wasn't a lot of commenting in the code explaining what certain lines or groups of code did. So later, when they would find a problem where, for example, they would go to change missile guidance dynamics and suddenly POS shields stop working, it's like trying to untangle a plate of spaghetti. You reach in and you pull one single string of noodles, and all of a sudden that strand pulls 10 other things. And for the last 15, 20 years, they've been fighting with spaghetti code. Up until about mid-2018, it was a real problem. So as a quick high-level overview and timeline of releases, I want you to keep in mind that CCP Games was working with a lot of different conflicting priorities, a lot of conflicting demands on their time, and a lot of problems that they had been attempting to overcome from their early years' development that they could suddenly invest time in fixing now that they had the budgetary and financial support of investors and other projects that were making money at different levels. So here we have a quick high-level overview of the timeline of releases. Expansions are marked in red. Releases are marked in blue. Events in green. Significant lore events and attraction events in purple and yellow. Now, for those of you who are watching this and not listening to this article or to this video like a podcast, I want you to understand that a lot of what you're seeing here is a result of the intensification of development focus on EVE. It's not that before May 2014 there wasn't a ton of development. It's just that CCP Games hadn't reached a point of maturity where they adopted what Microsoft refers to the TikTok cycle of development. The separating differences between an expansion and a release are really a matter of sophistry. Releases happen on a regular basis. These are opportunities for CCP Games to release new content, release new features, or unveil side projects that different developers may have been working on by the side of their desk, introduce new systems, and to have a release cycle by which they, on one release, focus on new features, and then on the following release, focus on cleanup and balance passes. And cleanup might be things like fixing the calculation on an explosion radius on a missile, or fixing how art appears over the model of the ship after something happens, or changing how the camera tracks an exploding ship after it leaves its wreck. These are all things that get adjusted in the code, but it also means taking out sections of code that are antiquated or poorly serve the game experience or the game launcher. And getting rid of a lot of that old spaghetti code was a big part of being able to move to a 64-bit launcher, to getting rid of things that were deeply tied into that spaghetti code and into that 32-bit experience, like walking in stations, were all things that needed to come out of the game to drive the game forward and to take advantage of new language, new systems, and just a better code base, really, and really cleaning up the environment so it's much more sustainable in the long term. Expansions, very much like releases, but typically expansions include the features of multiple vectors. So there'll be a balance pass, there will be code improvements, there will be cleanup, there will be brand new features and new content, new ships. Typically an expansion includes a lot of the above and may include the component pieces of multiple releases. And that's why expansions are very much hyped. They're typically pointed to as being the big release events. An expansion comes out, it's an opportunity for CCP Games to hype the crap out of it and get engagement redriven in the game. And really, one of the reasons there's such an intensification of releases and expansions from May 2016 through to 2020 is because they've been able to pour more money onto EVE, but also because they've been able to get rid of a lot of the old spaghetti code. They've been able to clean things up to a point where the game is really in a healthier state. And, really the red lines here in this timeline, the expansions, they're hype opportunities. It's mostly a marketing ploy because we saw in the release of Carnix and Aegis, in Valkyrie, in the launch of side projects like Valkyrie, the introduction of injectors, Project Discovery, both as a biochem and as an exoplanets venture. A lot of these releases, the March release from 2018, all included tons of content. Operation Frostline was a launch that included all kinds of new dynamics, new vessels, everything else. In its own way, the launch of Project Discovery and the launch of Operation Frostline should have been called expansions for the amount of things that they included, when really they were just releases. So think of expansions as a marketing opportunity, whereas the typical release development is where a lot of the heavy lifting happens and where a lot of the meat of the game comes out. Now, significant lore events. These are events that are built up around keeping players invested in the story of New Eden. Whereas attraction and retention events are the opportunities to either shake things up in the player base and introduce a question of doubt, and to shake up people's idea of how New Eden exists and to significantly disrupt that story. and also opportunities to engage a sticky loyalty. And when I say sticky, I mean that a rigid adherence and retention to playing the game. And that includes the new bonus SP weekends and weeks and the, skilling events. Skillings is just a means and so on. Those are opportunities to keep people logging in and to bolster those peak concurrent user counts. And I think a lot of this intensification of development has happened really to CCP's credit. There's been more active development of features since 2017 than in the previous 14 years. And it's amazing. I agree with a lot of what they've done. There are some areas where, I think there's room for improvement, but there are a lot of really good things have come out of this drive for development. And since I was talking about peak concurrent user counts, people love to say, oh, Eve is dying, and point back to, the days of mid-2014 when, peak concurrent user counts were between 50 and 60,000 people logged in at any given time on peak, prime time. But people forget that was the top of the curve. Like that was the peak, peak Eve. It hasn't fallen off since then. It's really more plateaued. And while we have peaks and troughs in the peak concurrent user count, the average holding line's about 40,000 players at peak prime time, and falling as low as 30. But I mean, it's not an unhealthy amount of subscribership or active players for a game. And obviously, Eve is to some degree profitable. Otherwise, the game would never have appeared viable as a purchase for Pearl Abyss. So one thing I will point out, though, is that the timing of expansions always comes at the end of a trough. It always happens when you need to bolster the peak concurrent users. And maybe this is, brushing away some of the fog of war for people who aren't familiar with development timelines and aren't familiar with, marketing concepts. But understand that this is just supply and demand. This is a healthy engagement relationship between the developers and the players. When they see we need something to keep us engaged, they give it to us and they market it to us. And, whether you agree or disagree with the individual moves, I'm, for one, not a huge fan of the recent push on wormholes. But I strongly support their model where they're giving us more of what we want. And I think everyone who complains about the general motions in Eve and the general directions of development, or who constantly cry out, oh, cloaky camping, a lot of that can be removed and a lot of that can be ignored in the context of the greater development of the arc of where Eve is headed. And if you look at this and you observe this at a high level, and you start to dig in and look at year-by-year analyses of how these changes have come in and what they've added to the greater game, we have Eve in a place right now where it is healthier than it has ever been. And I encourage you to watch the following videos that I'm going to release so you can see how the years have changed and what they've brought with them and the kind of big pass improvements that have come to the game. So that if you're a returning player and you're coming back to this with fresh eyes, or if you're a new player and you want to understand how things have gotten to where they are, I hope to give that to you. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the comment section below. I do attempt to answer everybody's questions. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to know when the next videos are coming out, just press the little subscribe button there and hit the bell so that you get a notification when the new videos are released. I'm trying to release videos on Mondays and Fridays, whenever my development schedule gives me time to pump them out and schedule them in place. So expect to see those coming out 2 a week over the next couple of weeks. Thanks so much. Talk to you again soon.